235 dead, 125 wounded. The death toll is expected to climb. In Egypt's Sinai, somewhere between Rafah and the Suez Canal, getting closer to Cairo. The carnage, the turmoil in the dictatorship that is now Egypt is drawing closer. The carnage is as inexplicable as it is dastardly. How can something calling itself the Islamic State justify, how can they possibly begin to explain murdering 235 Muslims coming out of a mosque in the Sinai Desert in Egypt? This was not an attack on the tyrant Sisi. This was not even an attack on his conscripted armed forces. This was mass murder of worshippers coming out of a mosque. Now, this kind of terrorist atrocity is now happening so often. There is a very severe danger of ourselves becoming inured to it. Certainly, I look for the Eiffel Tower to be lit up in the colours of Egypt this evening. I look for some emergency response from Facebook and Google and Amazon and all the usual choreographers of grief. I look for people putting on their Twitter avatars the flag of Egypt, and you know what? I won't find any of that, because the truth is that when these things happen far away, and especially to Muslims, they're very quickly forgotten. And we have backed the tyranny, the usurper, the general, Sisi. We've just had him on the TV being described as the president of Egypt. The president of Egypt is in jail. He was overthrown by a military coup with General Sisi at the top of it. And you may well be seeing a pattern here, because the longer we go on buttressing, propping up, arming, excusing these tyrants who rule the Arab world almost from the Atlantic to the Gulf without exception, the more fanaticism, radicalization, and extremization and terror we are helping to create. Discuss. And we'll be discussing Zimbabwe. You may have heard me reprove Yasmin Khan during the talk-up, during the handover. You know, a little knowledge is extremely dangerous. And I heard someone, I hope we weren't paying for him, utter such tosh about Zimbabwe. I wondered if he was a teenage scribbler, but he turns out not to be a teenager at all. Let me be as candid with you this week as I was last week. From the Reverend Ndambaningi Sithole to the new president, Emerson Mnangagwa, I have known them all. Mugabe was much easier to say, but not least because we had 37 years to practice. I have known them all. But let me correct one or two things, because I sense a campaign beginning to get up and running. Emerson Mnangagwa is not called Crocodile because he's sly or cunning or he'd make good shoes, as our expert said earlier in reviewing the trends on Twitter. Mnangagwa is called the Crocodile because he led a guerrilla unit called the Crocodile, so called because it had to crawl on its hands and knees through the bush and the blood against the apartheid armies of white Rhodesia and fight, kill, and die for the liberation of their country. What's happened, you see, is no sooner has Mugabe fallen, then the usual suspects have moved in on television, on radio, in print, and I have no doubt at all on the ground, to make sure that it's not just Mugabe that goes, but that it's ZANU-PF and the liberation struggle and the revolution that they carried out. I said last week, let me repeat it, I was never a supporter of Mugabe in the first place. Unlike Lord Carrington, unlike Margaret Thatcher, unlike Lord Soames, I never liked Mugabe. I was with the other fellow, Joshua Nkomo. So I'm not responsible for Mugabe. The British are, and the apartheid regime in Rhodesia is, because it was their refusal. In 1,000 years, said Ian Smith, to countenance majority rule in their country, that created the necessity of the brutal military struggle that had to take place in order that every man and every woman in Zimbabwe would qualify for a vote. Blame them, not people like me. But I'm certain of one thing. I heard, you'll believe this or not, John Humphreys on Radio 4 of the BBC this week say that perhaps what's required in Zimbabwe is the return of white farmers. He may be interested to know that Mafeking has been relieved some 100 years on. The idea that what has happened in Zimbabwe is because they're black, and the antidote to it might very well be that we need some more whites, is so deeply racist and offensive. Well, you'd think it was coming from a country and from an establishment that supported apartheid for decades before it was overthrown. We will be looking at Emerson Mnangagwa. We'll be asking if, like the ANC leadership in South Africa, after Mandela, it went to smaller people, metaphorically speaking, smaller and smaller people, metaphorically speaking. We'll be asking, is the new president up to the job? And we'll be talking about this week's budget on the subject of people not being up to the job. Has there ever been a more desiccated calculating machine than Philip Hammond? Has anyone ever seen a front-rank politician of such mediocrity deliver a budget of such mediocrity? At the end of it, did you feel that any of the great crises in British public life were resolved with this popinjay, Philip Hammond, at the dispatch box of the Chancellorship of the Exchequer? And on the subject further of people not being up to the job, I saw Theresa May in Brussels today. I'm going to shock you, because you almost certainly didn't know this. Theresa May in Brussels today gave £100 million of your money, 100 million, to help combat Russian disinformation campaigns in Eastern Europe. Now, I don't know what disinformation campaigns this refers to. What I do know is that I could think of 100 things more worthy of £100 million of your money from the British Exchequer to be given away by the British Prime Minister. I'll give you one that's just broken. She's just told the Mayor of Greater Manchester that she isn't, after all, going to pay for the carnage created by the terrorist cell that she nourished and cosseted in Manchester, the so-called Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. The clue was in the name. They were sent there. They were comforted there. They were nourished there. They were allowed to travel back and forward, back and forward from the war zone of Libya until they turned the Manchester Arena into a blood-soaked charnel house. And she promised Manchester that she would pay the bill for the cleaning up of the mess. And today she reneged on that promise. The same day that she gave away £100 million of your money to combat, quote, Russian disinformation campaigns in Eastern Europe. And that's before I even start on the £40 billion, that's 40,000 million pounds of your money that she's going to offer the European Union in a bid to get them to begin talking to us about trade relations after we leave the European Union. What a mess we are in. I advance this proposition. Britain has not been in a bigger mess since Dunkirk, and has never been led by a worse group of Tory politicians since Neville Chamberlain and his hapless gang of appeasers, blunderers, and incompetents. Discuss all of these things on the mother of all talk shows.